Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Way Forward. We're going to be talking about collegiate athletics, the future in the face of a lot of changes that are going on. We've just finished March Madness, a very exciting run up to the competition with some underdogs, including our own St. Pete's from the MAC conference that Quinnipiac belongs to. And I want to put the whole future of collegiate athletics in front of this august panel, and let me introduce them. I'll introduce them alphabetically. Greg Amodio is the Quinnipiac Director of Athletics since 2015, previously Director of Athletics at Duquesne and at Xavier University. He served as Chair of the MAC Committee on Athletic Administration with an undergraduate from Davis and Elkins and a master's from Queens College. Senator Chris Murphy, welcome, representing Connecticut from 2013 as our senator. Prior to this, he was a congressman of the 5th District between 2007 and 2013, and before that, a state senator in Connecticut. Along with U.S. Representative Laurie Tran, he introduced the College Athlete Economic Freedom Act. He has a bachelor's from Williams and a JD from UConn. And President Mike Schill, 18th president of the University of Oregon, previously served as dean and Harry Wyatt professor of law at the University of Chicago Law School, previously served as dean of the law school at UCLA. He is chair of the Pac12 CEO group, and he's also on the board of governors of the NCAA. Though he is not speaking for either body today, he holds a bachelor's degree from Princeton and a JD from the Yale Law School. And I'm Judy Oley, and I'm president of Quinnipiac University. Thanks everyone for being here. And please enter your questions as we go in the Q&A. So let's start with the basics. President Schill, I'll call you Mike. How do you characterize student benefits from being a student athlete? You're on mute, Mike.
I'll never get used to this. Okay, so there are lots of benefits for student athletes. Obviously, there's full tuition scholarships for many of the athletes, also cost of attendance. There are enhanced meals available. We have a meal every day for our students, at least one meal. We have concierge medicine. We have care for athletes after if they've been injured, they get the care now and they get care into the future. We also have mental health professionals that we bring in specifically for student athletes. We have academic support, which is specifically for student athletes. We have career development, things like writing resumes, interviewing skills, all of those sort of things. We have, lastly, and the list is probably much longer than I'm giving you, is we now have financial awards for academic achievement, which is made possible through the Alston case that was just decided ultimately by the Supreme Court. So we when we towed it all together, we towed for someone with a full scholarship, which is most of our football team and many of our athletes in other sports. It's about the value is about $150,000 per year for these student athletes. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing more. That just means it's a factual description.
And Greg, could you describe what you think the responsibilities and burdens are on student athletes as athletes?
Clearly, they have to manage the daily rigors between the academic side and the athletic side. First and foremost, we want to make sure that they have a solid academic standing, attend practice, engage in competition, and be active members in the campus community and the local community. It's an all-in on building our student athletes and preparing them for the next level in life. So those are some of the core expectations that we look for.
So let me turn to you, Senator, and ask you to explain what you view as the rights of student athletes, whether they're economic or educational or transfer. How do you view that in light of the benefits and burdens on student athletes?
Well, first, I think there's tremendous benefit to students who are engaged in athletics. I frankly would have paid money to be a Division I athlete. I wasn't good enough. I tried my hand in Division III, but I'm a better person because of my experience in athletics, and I am a huge college sports fan. I think it unites communities. It brings people of different political persuasions and ethnicities behind their home state team or their local team. There's just incredible value that comes from participating in college athletics and rooting for college athletics. But I guess by way of answering your question, Judy, and I'll be quick about it because there's lots of ways we can go. I just don't buy that this is amateur athletics any longer. I mean, anybody that watched that national championship game saw that Superdome filled with fans and all the presenting sponsors couldn't really distinguish the product on the field from the product in the pros. In fact, sometimes it's better. Sometimes there's more people and more money attached to the presentation of college athletics. So when you ask the question about rights, I think you first have to ask the question, is this amateur athletics any longer? Or is it really just a different version of professional athletics? And if it's just a different version of professional athletics, then I think you have to look at the rights of the players in the same way that you'd look at the rights of any other professional engaged in a very lucrative professional endeavor. And I know we'll get into the conversation about the difference between what the national championship game looks like in college basketball and what the national championship match looks like in Division I tennis. It's different. There's different amounts of money around it. But I guess when I think of rights, I sort of think you have to first sort of cut to the core of whether we can really call this amateur any longer.
And I'll come back to whether they are amateurs or professionals across the board, because I think Quinnipiac is a very different place than, for example, the University of Oregon or Alabama in football. But let's start with some of the basics and some of the changes that have happened in the landscape for student athletes. And the first is NIL, which stands for name, image, and likeness. And there was a watershed moment a year ago, July 1, when the NCAA lifted restrictions on student athletes from receiving endorsement monies, paid sponsorship deals, managing the marketing of their personal brand. And there are some very interesting examples. I'll just mention a few. Alabama quarterback nicknamed JaQuincy Kool-Aid McKinstry signed a deal with Kool-Aid for his name, image, and likeness degree, a deodorant signed with 14 student athletes to inspire people to break limits. There are also student athletes that are using their name, image, and likeness for nonprofit and community reasons. Our own UConn's I'm not UConn, but we are Connecticut. UConn's Paige Buckers had a deal with Chegg and Goodard to provide 6,000 free meals through this chain, or others have started GoFundMe's and no profits to help through crisis using their NIL. So, Senator, you've pushed for through the bill of the College Athletes Economic Freedom Act. You've pushed for NIL, among other things. Why is it so important that the name, image, and likeness of athletes is no longer controlled or restricted by universities or the NCAA?
Well, I just think we've had this paternalistic attitude towards student athletes that, frankly, is not justified. We don't limit the NIL rights of the coaches, right? The coaches get to go out and make millions of dollars. I see Nick Saban on TV, every hour on the hour, hawking a variety of different products. And that apparently isn't a explosion of the amateur nature of college athletics, but it is for his kids who are largely low income, who are largely Black. And I just don't know why we don't trust the kids to be able to go out and do the exact same deals that their coaches do. And so I'm interested in, frankly, allowing the kids to do whatever they feel is necessary in order to be able to make some money off of a product they are putting on the field for nothing other than the salary and the package of benefits that President Schill outlined. And I understand that comes with some discomfort, but I think ultimately we should trust the kids and give them the opportunity, especially for those that aren't going to have lucrative opportunities after college, to be able to reap some of the rewards in the way that we allow all the adults that are coaching them to reap the rewards.
So President Schill, how does this have some consequences that might turn student athletics into more of a money game? That there are some opportunities for some pernicious consequences here?
Yes, I mean, I think that so first, I agree with the senator 100%. This is, it's high time that the student athletes, and I'm using the word student athletes, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but that the student athletes have the ability to utilize their name, image, and likeness and get financial returns on that. I think that's important. I think that quite honestly, the NCAA waited too long to do that. And I think, we're very grateful for the states in the United States, many of which, including the state of Oregon, came up with the NIL bills to allow that. The problem is, right now, we're not in a stable place. We have about 30, 40 different state statutes, and they're all different from each other, and they all have different rules governing what universities can do, what students can do. And it's very hard to operate when you're in divisions that are multi-state divisions, and then you play against other teams in other parts of the country. And unless we want our athletic teams to become professional, and I don't, and I disagree with Senator Murphy that that's what they are now. But unless we want them to turn into farm teams for big leagues, or then what we need to do is we need to make sure that the NIL reflects the value that the student's name, image, and likeness has. And instead of, and what we're starting to see, and what I'm really worried about, is inducements that donors, boosters, or this was the thing we were worried about at the beginning, is how do you make sure that NIL isn't being used to recruit students? If you come to me, I will give you $1 million, right, or of endorsements, and that is we don't want that. I mean, we want students to go to the school that they want to be at, to go to be in the region that they want to be at, and so what we need, I believe, and I'm glad Senator Murphy is part of this, we need federal legislation. We need federal legislation that provides a uniform federal definition of allowable NIL, so everybody's on an even playing field. And one of the things that's going on is, one of the reasons NCAA is not enforcing NIL rules, because we're scared to death that we're going to get an antitrust suit if we do anything. So what we need, in addition to a level playing field with a national NIL rule, is a limited exemption from the antitrust law that allows us to enforce the rule.
Okay, so I just want to get to the perspective of a non-Power 5 athletic conference athletic director, and just ask, what does NIL do for you, and not being a Power 5 team or program?
I agree with the commentary from both of the individuals that have spoken before me. It's not about concept, it's about application. I feel in some ways Mike and I are sharing each other's notes, because these are all the things that I've got listed on my paper in front of me. We want this to happen, and this is the best way for this to happen is if we put educational modules in place to walk the student athletes through this. But without a level playing field, we've got an opportunity to move in different directions here. More recently, the whole thought process of collectives that donors are putting together, and they're working on the fringes of the department, if not even connected to the department or the institution, and how the collectives are funneling money is a concern. And I think the one thing that I keep in mind here is that the ability to go ahead and take advantage of the NIL is during the time where you're competing as a college student athlete. The vast majority of individuals will not be able to use their athletic prowess to make a living in the future. So there's still nothing more important than the 4-year degree that student athlete will walk away with, because that will form the building blocks for their future.
So let me ask a couple of other questions related to NIL. Probably most student athletes who have value in their name, image, or likeness are deriving it from this interaction between their own athletic competency and the brand of the institution. So I think it's now 28 or 30 states that have NIL legislation. Some of them allow for the brand of the university to be used by the individual student on their t-shirt as they advertise a big Q for Quinnipiac, and some don't. Does the institution have any rights to whatever the returns are on NIL, given the fact that the brand of the institution is in part at least propelling the athlete to their value? And I mean, Senator, you can take a first cut.
Well, I mean, right now, the institution holds the monopoly
Correct.
on the return on the brand. I mean, right now, it is only the institution that gets to market the merchandise and control the merchandise that reaps the rewards of the big TV contracts, right? That has the revenue from the sponsoring entities on the stadium. I mean, so I don't know what the question is. Should there be? I have no problem with there being arrangements between universities and kids to share in the marketing cost. If Joe Burrow's LSU jersey is for sale, then probably there should be some arrangement worked out where LSU gets a little bit of the money and Joe Burrow gets a little bit of the money. And again, to me, you know, that arrangement is worked out in the pros. I don't see why it couldn't be worked out in at least big time college athletics. But again, you sort of start from this place in which right now, the institution and the adults working for the institution have a monopoly on the revenue. And they have decided, I think this is just me, I think in an illegal way, to limit the revenue that goes to the students. And so I just think that I think that model is outdated. And I think there has to be a different means by which more of that revenue gets shared with the student athletes. And NIL is insufficient, by the way, in my view. I mean, I favor a revenue sharing model in which the programs and the conferences that are making significant amount of revenue, that there's some mechanism to share that with the kids. But yes, the bottom line is I absolutely think that there's in NIL arrangements, there should be a ability for students and universities to both benefit.
And I'm reminding people, and there are already a couple of questions in the Q&A, to please register your questions and I'll get to them. I want to just move on.
Can I comment on that for a second?
Yes.
I mean, I agree. I very much disagree with the revenue sharing concept, and we can talk about that later. But I very much agree. In fact, I would go even further. I mean, don't tell my board that I don't want money, but you know, let the students have their own NIL. I don't need to take a slice of their NIL. I think the harder question is when our quarterback does an NIL deal, is his notoriety, is the value behind our quarterback his own value, or does he share, is it the team's value? Is the reason that someone wants him in a poster just him, or is it that he's on a successful team and should, so I think the better question isn't don't share it with me as a university, but should that person share it with their teammates? And that becomes very difficult how you manage something like that.
Right, but again, I understand that many people object to my characterization of bowl championship level football as professional, but that arrangement works very well in the pros in terms of how organizations and players share in the marketing of jerseys. So you don't have to make it up from whole cloth. There's a means by which to do that.
Yeah, I don't know many professional football players who are required to attend class and required to maintain a certain GPA and required to abide by all the university rules. So this goes to the professional versus, personally, when the NLRB general counsel said that we shouldn't be using the word student athletes, I was offended because they are students. I always say they're students. I always talk to them as students. I mentor them as students, and they act like students much of the time. So I don't think it's as simple as professional versus non-professional.
Yeah. So let me get to this other part about being professionals or in fact employees. And I want to just ask, before I get to Senator Murphy, where this is part of the proposed legislation, to open it up for collective bargaining rights to certain teams or to the team's employees. Now, remember that most, and this picks up on what our coach, women's rugby coach, has just entered into the Q&A, Becky Carlson, saying, I don't earn much money. I'm a beneficiary of the university's support of athletics. We certainly, I can tell you as the president, and Greg hears this rather frequently, we heavily support our athletic programs. We're not making money on them. So either there's a very different playing field, and so we're either creating huge unevenness in these divisions, Division 1A, B, C. But what are the ramifications of treating student athletes as potential employees, paid employees, employees that have collective bargaining rights? So I'm going to start first with the AD perspective and then end with you, Senator, and Mike, you can chime in the middle. So Greg.
Yeah, my fear is that it just upends the entire enterprise in many ways in a negative way. And I'm for change and progression and moving things forward and making sure that the student athletes are taken care of. But there's to your point, Judy, such a vast divide between the Power Fives and then mid-majors to low majors, the revenue streams that are coming in. We're not beneficiaries of a $50 million a year broadcast check that we're getting from the conference. Frankly, we get zero money from the conference. We pay dues to help operate the conference. So there's such a vast divide between the top and the bottom to try and figure out the sweet spot where you can create a value proposition up and down the chain is a difficult one to manage.
So, one of the big, and so we are Power Five and we have a big contract. The Pac12 has a big contract with networks, although not big enough for many of our fans or sports writers. But the underlying truth of this is, although there's a significant amount of revenue, it's all football. It is overwhelmingly football that's generating the revenue for the individual schools. And almost all of that revenue, most places more than that revenue, is basically redistributed to the other sports, the Olympic sports, the Title IX sports that we have. And essentially, if you were to pay athletes, student athletes, what you would end up doing, I don't know if you would even call them student athletes at that point, but you'd pay them. And what would happen is universities would either, and certainly universities that aren't Power Five universities, would either have to end their sports because they couldn't afford them anymore, Or what they would have to do if you're a Power 5 university is if all of a sudden your costs are going up exponentially in the revenue sports, you're going to have to cut, you won't have the revenue anymore for the non-revenue sports like, soccer or volleyball or any number of other Olympic sports. And that's problematic. And the other option is to take the money out of student tuition. And we won't do that at Oregon. We don't believe that student tuition should go to subsidize the athletic department. And so if you're in that situation, it's got to be the money that's in the athletic department. And if there's not enough because costs are going up, then it's going to cut sports.
Yeah, and this is obvious. This is an argument that is, that's frequently made, that if we were to pay athletes in the money-making sports, at the money-making programs, even at those programs, that would have a consequence for the students that are not in those sports. I guess I have a hard time understanding why that's true. I mean, I went to a Division III school in which the football program made no money. We didn't have a model in which our football program subsidized the rest of athletics, but we had a full athletic program that was made available to the students. It was a much lower cost program than the programs at the University of Oregon or even Quinnipiac University. But they were really good programs. Kids had a great time. They gained an enormous amount of benefit from it, as did those that attended the games. And so there are plenty of schools, frankly, high schools amongst them, who show how you can have meaningful athletics that are not built on a cross-subsidization from one sport to the other. The other sort of thing to contemplate is, why can't you just redistribute money within the football program? I mean, I don't know what Pac-10 salaries are, but Jim Harbaugh makes $7.5 million at the University of Michigan. I think a $50,000 a year stipend to each football player would be a pretty good deal, would allow them to put some food on the table for their families, maybe hold it in a trust fund. They don't get it until after they graduate. If Jim Harbaugh made $1 million a year, which I don't think I'll see $1 million a year in my entire life, if he made $1 million a year instead of $7.5 million a year, the University of Michigan could afford a $50,000 stipend every single year for every football athlete. So this idea that by paying the athletes, you have to take money from the football program, not really, if you just choose to pay the coaches a little bit less. And plenty of other schools have shown that you can have meaningful sports participation at a lower cost than the programs exist today.
Senator, I mean, and I speak from Quinnipiac's experience, those programs are being paid for by the university and they're not making money.
Right.
And in that sense, there is a significant portion of Division I athletics where this wouldn't apply, the model of collective bargaining. And so let me ask you, first of all, and we have Cinderella stories, let's say in basketball, such as St. Pete's or UMBC a few years ago. Would that be possible in the future when you have such unevenness in the competitive landscape? Or are we breaking Division I and Division II and Division III into very small fragments here?
Yeah, I do think that major college athletics, in particular, Power 5 football, does act as kind of a minor leagues for the pros. And so I get it. Again, I'm the skunk in the garden party here. I think we should just admit that and start sort of paying the kids as if they are minor league athletes. And yes, that might end up in a separation, right? A series of schools deciding that they want to be in the business of being feeder programs to the pros. Those schools being required to share that revenue with students. And then another set of schools deciding that they do not want to be in that business. They do not want to sort of chase that level of competition, and having a level of investment in athletics that is much lower, that does not require, that does not generate revenue and does not require a compensation of athletes. Because again, I sort of go back to where I started. I do think there's tremendous value in big time college athletics. I love big time college athletics. I think it shouldn't go away, but it might mean that we kind of do have to have a break. And that the consequence, you're right, Judy, might mean that you don't get the St. Peter's playing against the UNCs as often. And that might be a consequence, but I'm willing to accept that consequence to end what I think is a fundamental economic injustice of these high level, incredibly lucrative athletes not being able to make money.
Senator, if I may, with all due respect, all that I want you to do today is, not today, but in the future, is to think through the consequences of what your bill is and you know where we want to end up in intercollegiate sports, and then act back and then think backwards to what the legislation is. I don't disagree with some of what you're saying. Some of it's just factually probably not. I mean, taking $5 million from Bill Harbaugh is probably not going to pay the costs of paying players, right? If they're unionized, it's just not. And so there is going to be a cost. You're going to see a dissolution of intercollegiate athletics, and your state may have nobody playing in D1 or in the, and you know, whether that's good or bad depends on your values, but you seem to think it's a good thing to have big, you know, teams. And the other thing is, in terms of I don't think Oregon is a feeder school to the professional leagues. I mean, I think our students would like it to be. I think that, you know, if you have 100 and X, maybe 120 people on our football team, they all think that they're going to end up in the pros. They're not, right? Maybe a handful will end up in the pros. So, you know, the rest are going to get an education, and the rest are going to be able to go out and get a job. And that is where I want to focus on. I want to focus on the educational process, and professionalizing, or calling us professional, is diminishing that connection to what I believe is the reason, the only reason why intercollegiate athletics is in a university. Why not just, if it is what you think, just spin them all off into private corporations.
Yeah, and that's what's happening in basketball, right? I mean, as a consequence of not paying the athletes, that's in fact what is going to be the reality in 5 to 10 years. I mean, we've seen it. Kids have become wise to this. They realize that they don't need to go to school in order to be lucrative athletes. They are not allowed into the NBA because of what I would argue is collusion between the private professional leagues and the collegiate association. But these kids,
it's actually the players' union. It's the players' union. The
players' union, right? So they are now going off and becoming pros right out of high school. And if nothing changes within 10 years, none of the best high school basketball players will go to college. They will not get the chance to be student athletes because they are not willing to go give their talents for nothing. And the football players will follow. I guarantee you that eventually the football players will figure out, are you kidding me? I am forced to spend 3 years in college making no money for myself other than the scholarship, when I'm ready to be a professional, when people will watch me, pay money to watch me play, and those athletes will leave the college game. So whether the industry makes the decision or not, this is coming. The kids are going to figure out for themselves that they don't have to wait until they are 21 years old to make money if they are a talented quarterback or running back. So I sort of feel like these reforms are necessary in order to save college athletics, because the kids are going to, well, I think, potentially blow this up on their own.
If you think that, why don't we do it ourselves? Why do you need to save us? Why don't we save ourselves and look ahead and say, we need to do this, but we're not, no president.
Right, but nobody has. And right now, these kids in football, at least, don't have another option, right? And that's not their fault. And so the question is, listen, I think college athletics will run afoul of antitrust law. I mean, I know why the NCAA wants that exemption, because I think this ultimately is going to blow up from an antitrust standpoint. And so I think one way or the other, this is going to be forced upon college athletics, either through the courts or through the individual actions of students.
And let me try and insert myself here and just remind folks that part of the beauty of collegiate athletics is that you have more or less a level playing field, more or less, with the opportunity for these Cinderella stories, because it isn't that unequal now with NIL and selective collective bargaining, because clearly there are going to be the mid-majors and the lower majors that are not going to be engaging because they don't make money. They're not football schools. Then you have educational rights that are added. Are the rich going to pay more than the poor? And we have to remember, I think, and I'd love to hear also Greg comment on this, that very, very few athletes go on to the pros. I mean, most of them are getting a scholarship, as Mike said earlier, that is going to be valued at more than what their collective bargaining returns are going to be. So the question is how, first of all, talk about educational benefits, just so that people get it. I think Nick McCraven is asking about that. What does it mean? The Alston case, which enabled us to provide educational benefits, and for how long? For example, how long can a student come back for, get educational benefits, get even medical benefits? So Greg, just talk about that for a sec.
Sure. The way it's laid out, I believe it's in the neighborhood of $5,800 a year that can be put out in terms of additional academic benefits. It's an interesting story just published on ESPN earlier today, that out of all of the BCS schools, there are only 21 in the country that are presently offering those benefits. Check that out on ESPN.com. And then there's commentary there as well from different schools about, were they planning on doing it? Are they thinking about doing it? Are they considering doing it? And they're all over the map of trying to determine.
And what does that mean to you? What does that mean to you, given the fact that it's only 21?
I think, again, everything's been moving so quickly. And we're at a collision point right now, clearly, in regards to what the landscape looks like. And there's so many things happening. Again, from Alston to NIL to the transfer portal, which we haven't even discussed, and the craziness of that. There are now over 1,000 men's basketball and 1,000 women's basketball student athletes who have entered the transfer portal to be able to move around and move to a different institution.
And play immediately.
And in some cases play immediately. So, that's another piece of the market that's opened up for the student athlete to be able to find a space that makes more sense for them, both socially, competitively, academically. But I think to our point, Judy, where we fall in again is that because we're so significantly funded by the institution, where are those dollars coming from to offer those Alston benefits? And therein lies the biggest rub. The money has to come from somewhere. So it's either additional investment in a very, very difficult economic environment in higher education, or you have to take from other places in the enterprise to be able to support that.
And maybe take from other sports too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, I think if athletics is essential to the college experience, then I don't think anybody should have a problem with tuition dollars subsidizing athletics as they do at, like I said, my Division III college, right? There are plenty of colleges in which tuition dollars go to pay for athletics because the belief is it is an essential part of the collegiate experience. It's just at certain colleges, it's a lot less expensive than it is if you're running, a Division I program. And I think when you talk about the even playing field, to President Schill's point, it is true that college football dominates and sort of wags the dog. And that's not great for the other athletes at these programs. I mean, I watched my university in Connecticut chase a conference based upon the right fit for its football program. And it ended up with the rest of the athletes kind of just being along for the ride. And so, for a period of years, we ended up in an athletic conference that had no teams in the Northeast, that had teams as far away as Oklahoma and Texas. And that guaranteed a little bit of extra TV revenue because it was the best football conference we could get into. But it really didn't make a lot of sense for all the rest of our sports teams to be traveling those distances when there were leagues right in our backyard that we could have been a part of. And so, that's the other piece. And I have sympathy for I think the college sports industry should have thought through this before making college football such a behemoth. It's a choice that was made, but that's another thing to really worry about is the choices that get made on behalf of all the other athletes in order to make the football program viable and profitable.
So let me just suggest you're concerned about having students traveling. We don't have that issue, and football isn't everything. It is everything with regard to the revenue,
right?
But it isn't everything. Our most popular sport is women's basketball, but it also has the biggest deficit. And the reason isn't because of a decision that President Schill has made. The decision is because that's what the fans want, and that's what the fans will pay for tickets, and that's who's going to watch the games on Saturdays, and what the contract will be for that. So I mean, I don't think it's fair to say that we have made that decision. And again, at a university like the University of Oregon, all of the sports, both men's and women's sports, are funded off of the surplus that is generated by football. So I don't think players in those sports would be saying, oh yeah, let's diminish the profitability of football, because they would be cutting off their nose to spite their face.
I'm gonna segue because I'm also mindful of the senator's time, and I'm just gonna ask one more question because he's leaving, and I'll finish up with President Schill and Greg. Senator, what do you think, because you're obviously engaging in federal legislative proposals that at least this group is arguing would apply to a small segment of collegiate athletics, but with this panoply of state legislation that's different, we need federal legislation. So thank you for that part of it. But what do you think the role of the NCAA should be in the future? Because
minimal. I mean, yeah, I don't. The NCAA would like to control the NIL rights of players, and so the legislation they have requested to sort of create the floor that President Schill talks about, and I agree. I mean, I think the current situation is likely not sustainable. It would be better for us to have a federal uniform standard for NIL. I would argue we should also have a federal requirement for revenue sharing. But I think the NCAA would like us to just essentially deputize them as the regulatory agency, which I don't think makes sense. I really don't see much of a role for the NCAA. My legislation contemplates giving a pretty absolute right to the students, and I don't buy that we should be as worried as others think we should about the arrangements that students might make in order to make money. Again, we don't seem to be worried about those arrangements when it comes to the adults as part of these programs. So I'm not sure why we need to be worried about the kids. I just think that there's no industry out there like this one, where there's this much money in the industry, and there is a pretty hard cap on the amount of money that the most important laborers are reaping from that. And I do categorize it as a civil rights issue. I really do, because I just don't think you can ignore the fact that, especially when it comes to big time football and basketball, these are largely African-American players, and these are almost exclusively non-African American coaches. And I just think that gives this a tinge of additional urgency to figure out how to share the revenue in a different way than we are today. There are lots of people getting very, very rich off of college athletics. And I just can't stand by. I understand the point that we could just hope that the industry fixes it themselves, but I just can't stand by without, trying to press, at least with the bully pulpit I have, to make that sort of reform conversation happen more.
Judy, can I just say something while the senator's on?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
So number
I
one,
want to say one thing. Mhm.
I agree with you 100%. I want the minimal role for the NCAA, believe me. So we are totally in agreement on this. And
Mike would probably want lower salaries for coaches. My guess is.
I'd be certainly happy to talk about that. And what I also would love to see us working together to come up with something that is sustainable, because I also agree that the current situation, or the situation prior to the state NILs, was unsustainable and wrong. And so I think there's a lot of commonality that we have, but I think you have to be very careful to understand where it all ends up. And if it ends up with us falling apart, it's not going to be good.
And the unintended consequences are twofold. Number one, to the non-major sports within a program, and number two, to all, what is it, 350 schools are members of Division I. I think we're probably talking about 20 of those 350. So what happens to that level of competition that occurs and is so fantastic for the student athletes, first of all, and then also the spectators from this kind of legislation? So how do we deal with those, despite the fact that there are very essential arguments that you're making in the legislation?
There are no doubt that there are a myriad of very tough questions involved in how you reform college athletics. But the mere fact that those questions are tough to answer should not be a barrier to an attempt to answer them. We get caught in this position all the time in Congress, in which we have a status quo that is unacceptable, but because dislocation becomes very scary, we end up sticking with the status quo. And so I take the challenge from you, Mike. I think we do have a lot of the same interests here. I just want us to commit ourselves to reform rather than just saying, it's too tough. It won't be 100% fair. There will be winners and losers. Well, all of that is true today. This system isn't fair. There are winners and losers today. So I'm confident that we can build a system that is better for everybody.
Appreciate it, and appreciate your leadership, Senator. And we'll let you go, and I'm going to keep Mike and Greg still on here. And thanks very much. We do all agree that what you're doing is needed. The question is the tweaking.
Thanks to everybody.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask the both of you a question that came from Dan Murphy, and I'll just give a couple of stats here. The final four in March Madness men's, each of those conferences will earn about $10 million, and then they distribute it however they distribute it. The final four for women, each of their teams' conferences earned $0. So there's a question here from Dan Murphy. If women's basketball is your, Professor Schill's, most popular sport, why not charge more for tickets? The idea that the women's basketball tournament or enterprise loses money is mostly due to flawed accounting practices and poorly negotiated broadcast rights. Please help us.
I would love to help you, because I actually love women's basketball. It's my favorite sport. And I would love to see them get more revenue. And maybe they should, maybe the mechanism that we have in this country at least with the universities, is the revenue is that the amount that individual sports, the amount of revenue they get is related to the market. And the market is the reason we don't raise ticket prices is because we want, I mean, the fans are a different set of fans that go typically to women's basketball than men's basketball. They can afford less. They're bringing children with them, and we want to make it affordable, and we want them to be able to support the team. And so essentially, if we were to charge the men's prices, we would have a half empty stadium probably. And so we don't want that. And maybe the answer to this, in order to achieve gender equity among the sports, is to try to divorce change the economic model so it's totally divorced from what people want to see and what they're willing to pay.
Yeah, I'll just give you another stat, not to pile on. I looked for the number of viewers of the women's final game in the Final Four versus the men. Women, it was about 4.8 million, men over 18 million. Now, that could be because the broadcast structure is such that women's games are not promoted as much, they don't get as much visibility, et cetera, et cetera. Or you could say, as Mike is suggesting, that let's divorce the economic model from actual viewership and just, regardless of the returns, make it equal. But there are economic differences, unfortunately. Greg, do you have a perspective on that?
Nope, same commentary here. Clearly, there's different market influences here. The NCAA has tried to work through broader-based partnerships on the television side with the ESPN platforms. The fact that the two tournaments still are on top of each other, Friday, Saturday, Sunday into Monday, I think still creates a logjam. But I can clearly see from a program who went to the Sweet 16 a few years ago on the women's side, yeah, it would have been great to get more revenue from that for our institution and our conference. So, and something we haven't talked much about, but just came up in this piece of the conversation is, I think the gender equity piece is a significant element in all these conversations.
Yeah,
and it's not going to be, go ahead. Just
going back to the distribution as a result of the championship, zero is not the answer for sure, regardless of the economics. That seems entirely inequitable, and I hope that you, Mike, in your work on the governing board will help change that. But the Title IX issues, as Greg was alluding to, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Judy. And in addition, if we professionalize sports and create labor unions and pay athletes, that's just going to make the gender issues worse. Because then what you're doing is you're really the economic model just takes over everything. There
is no equivalency to football in women's sports.
Yeah, and so I think that it moves us further away from gender equity. And I believe we have a long way to go to achieve gender equity, and I'm supportive of those efforts.
Mike, I want to just ask you, because you, as the chair of the Pac12, as the presidential chair of the Pac12, you just hired a very different commissioner. And you hired a person who came out of the entertainment industry. He was president of entertainment and sports at MGM Resorts and doesn't have higher ed background. What's the motivation behind that?
Well, a couple of things. One is George. So we picked George Kliavkoff, and he is hitting a home run, and we are so pleased. He's making the selection committee look like geniuses every day. But we looked at two models. One, the traditional sort of AD model, which is in existence for a lot of commissioners, and more the business model. And we determined that we had that, as the senator would say, intercollegiate athletics is a big business, and there's a lot riding on it, that in terms of our universities and helping our students. And we wanted to have someone who is very sophisticated, helping us, particularly as we look to our next media contract. And the nice thing about George was we wouldn't have picked someone who didn't have a strong intuition and EQ with respect to universities and the student athlete experience, because the Pac-12 is we pride ourselves in being a conference which is really dedicated to student welfare. And if you look at us compared to at least some of the other divisions, we are a very different type of conference. Let's just put it that way.
Okay, I was going to ask you also about his indication that maybe the Pac-12 should get into gambling on betting on college sports, but I don't think we have time for that. What I will ask you both, starting with Greg, is who was your pick to win March Madness?
I was looking at North Carolina. I thought it was a great story for Hubert Davis as a first-year head coach to have a chance to win a national championship. So it looked good in the first half, not so good in the second half.
And what about before March Madness started? Did you have any of those final teams in your horizon?
I didn't. I think that's one of the nice things about college basketball on the men's side is there's a significantly larger amount of parity. So again, Judy, you and I had the conversation. When you look at St. Peter's on paper, it should be impossible for St. Peter's to beat the University of Kentucky. A $1.5 million operating budget against an $18 million operating budget. But that's what makes this thing so much fun and exciting and gets the fans going. So yeah, from that standpoint, it's really hard to predict. So I'm at the end of the day really happy when the games are just very, very good. And I think that's what we had in the final.
And of course, the question is, with these changes that are being proposed, is a St. Pete's progression against a Kentucky going to be possible because of the very uneven playing field? Mike, did you have a pick?
Well, my pick would have been the Oregon Ducks, but we didn't get in. So then my next pick is the school that you and I share. I was rooting for UCLA, and they did pretty well, but they weren't able to beat UNC. Heartbreaker.
I wanted to thank you. We could have gone on for another couple hours here with all that's happening in college athletics. Thank you so much. Thanks for the active discussion. And I also thank the senator for having participated and for what he's doing. It's not an easy out from all of the complexity that is occurring now. There's no doubt that we need change. The question is, how do you balance all of these nuanced consequences and sometimes unintended consequences with the need for change? So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
And go Ducks.
Go Ducks.
Go Bobcats.
And Bobcats.
Thank you.
Thank you.